Lesson 1.3 Classes, Layers and Stories. In this lesson you're going to learn when to use classes, learn when to use design layers, learn when to use stories and levels, learn how to control tool defaults, and learn how to save all of this into a template file. Back to Vectorworks. In this lesson we're going to look at classes, design layers, stories and levels. Let's start with looking at classes. I've got a sketch here which shows how we would tend to use classes for an architectural project. You can think of classes as defining a couple of different things. Number one, we can use classes to control graphic style, so it's the color, the line weight, the texture and so on. And we use classes to control visibility. That is whether we want to see that object in the same time as other objects. But how do you actually think about when to use a class and when to use a design layer? The idea is that classes define what that object is, the type of object. So for example, structural floor joists, that's the type of object. Walls, balustrades, demolished walls, existing walls, furniture, these are what things are. Fixtures, fittings, joinery, millwork. These are the type of objects that they are. So classes can be used to define what the object is. We can also use classes to help us to do things like calculate areas. For example, this particular image shows how I've used classes to help calculate areas for occupancy of the building. We can also embed our class strategy into things like wall styles and symbols. The idea of this is if I set up my wall style with the class already assigned to it, that's in this area just here, then every time I use this wall style, regardless of the active class up here, this wall will always be assigned to that class. This isn't something you can do with design layers. And with symbols, we can set up our library so that whenever we use this particular symbol from our library, regardless of what the active class is, up here, this object will always be assigned to my selected custom class. This is a great way of ensuring that when people use symbols from the library, they are automatically assigned to the correct class. So that's classes. What about layers? Layers can be thought of as breaking the building up into chunks. Foundations, lower floor, upper floor, roof. And you might notice that I've actually got some classes turned on in these different layers. So the idea of a design layer is to separate your building into manageable chunks. It's better if you set the building up according to the stories of the building. We'll get into stories in a minute. But first of all, you can think of design layers for structuring your file, creating the structure for your file so we know where ground is, we know where first is, and so on. For example, if we're dealing with stairs, we can say to the stair, start at the layer elevation of floor 1 and finish at the layer elevation of floor 2. Then Vectorworks will calculate the vertical height between the two layers of the building. If you move one of those layers, Vectorworks can recalculate that stair for you. Let's have a look at layers and classes together. So here's the same sketch, but now you can see I've got layers on the right hand side, classes on the left, and I've got both layers and classes working together to create my drawings. Layers are where things are, classes are what things are. The combination of these two allows us to structure our file so that we can work easily, we can work effectively, and we can create the drawings that we want. Now, stories and design layers. So we've talked about design layers, that they're chunks of the building. So I've got foundations and I've got floor and I've got floor 2 and I've got a roof above it. So what is a story? A story is a grouping of those design layers together. So for example, I might have foundations and floor 1 together in one story. I might have the floor 2 and the roof together in one story. When I move story 2, everything inside story 2 moves. If I move story 1, everything inside story 1 moves. So the idea of a story is that it groups together your design layers. Stories also have something called levels. Levels can create design layers, but they can also be used just to control the elevation of objects. So let's have a look at this area here. I want to blow up in detail. So here we are. Here we've got the bottom of the cladding. That might be a level that controls where the cladding stops and starts. There might be a level to control where the top of the cladding stops. Maybe there's a layer for the wall height. There might be a ceiling level that allows us to control, without changing our design layer, where does that ceiling actually sit in elevation. And we could perhaps have a skirting or a baseboard level to control where our skirtings or our baseboards stop and start. We also have the ability to connect our symbols to our levels, so that when we create a level, we can say, I want my wash hand basins to be at this level, or I want the head of my windows to be at this level, or I want my power points or my socket outlets to be at this level, so an elevation. When you create your symbols, you can say use that level, and if you change the level in the story setup, then all of those objects will move in elevation. It's very, very effective. Let's have a look at this in detail. So we'll get our skirting. We might have the top of our slab, the bottom of our slab, the bottom of our footings, or the bottom of our foundations, and the bottom of our footing. So those might be levels that you want to use. In a commercial building, you might use something a bit more like this, where we've got primary beams, secondary beams, ceilings, and you might have multiple stories, and you want to control each level. So the underside of the main beams might be different in this story than in this story. But that's okay, because each level has its own elevation in each story of the building. It's time to go ahead and actually make some of our stories, design layers, and levels. We'll start with our organization dialog box. You can get to it through here, or you can go to Tools on the menu bar and choose Organization. It really doesn't matter which way you start. We need to look at stories, and we need to edit our default story levels. If you don't edit your default story levels, and you create a lot of well-named levels in one particular story, you won't be able to reuse those names in the next story. So you need to edit the default story levels to start. You may have noticed in the previous images that I had names like top of footing, bottom of footing, top of foundation, that kind of thing. Names that I think are very clear and will be clear in the future as well. My challenge is when you've got something called a ledge. What is that exactly? Is it the top of the footing? Is it the bottom of the footing? Is it the edge of the brickwork? I mean, what exactly is it? If it's the underside of my brick cladding, why not call it underside of cladding? So let's get rid of the ones we don't want. We'll need finished floor. Top of structure, what does that mean? So let's edit some of these. We'll start with the foundation. Let's edit that one. The elevation for that foundation is 0 for me, because I like to set everything from my slab. Now the name that I like to use is foundation. Scale 1 to 50, that's going to be fine, but if your projects are larger, you might want to set all of your scales to 1 to 100, because as you create the design layers, Vectorworks will automatically scale them for you. And it's a good idea to have them all the same scale. So let's make all of those. For me, it's going to be 1 to 100. If you're using Imperial, then maybe you want to make it 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch. Just depends on your projects. So that's my foundation. So let's work up from the bottom of the building. So I've got the foundation there. What's the ledge? I have no idea, so I'm just going to delete it. Bottom of structure. Let's edit this one, because this is going to be a new level type, and it's going to be called bottom of footings. Bottom of footing. Okay, that's my level type. So it's a name. It's a name that makes sense. The elevation might be -3 feet or -900. So that's controlling a part of my structure. What about this one here, the bottom of structure? I'm not sure I want to call it bottom of structure roof, so I'm going to change the name of this level, and this level is going to be called a roof. Top of structure. Let's edit that one again. The top of the structure, why don't we call this the top of the footing? Its elevation is -600 or -2 feet, which gives me a 300 millimeters or 12-inch foundation. So we've got the bottom of footing, top of the footing, we've got a roof, we've got a top of structure, that's a slab. I don't like the name of that, so I'm going to call that a slab. And I better check my scales because I only changed one of them, I think. So that's a 1 to 100. Let's just have a look here. Check that. Aha. So I made a mistake there. Slab 1 to 100. So I'm just going to be very careful with these and make sure they've all got the same, wherever I'm creating a design layer, they've all got the same scale. Finished floor, I like to set my elevation to 0 and a scale of 1 to 100. So this is going to create a floor layer. It will create a layer called floor. And so everything's going to be in here. Now I've tried changing the name from finished floor to something else like walls, but it's more than walls. It's everything. It's everything in that level. So I'm just going to leave it as finished floor. What about my ceiling? So double click on this. This is my ceiling. It's going to create a ceiling. Better make sure it's the same scale. And I might have to change the elevation depending on the construction. So what other things might we use? Well, the bottom of cladding's missing, so we need to create a new one. So we need a new level type, bottom of cladding. Elevation, maybe -2 inches, -50 millimeters. We might have a new one, which might be the top of cladding. So if we've got a wall that's got bricks on the outside up to, say, 4 feet, that might be a particular level. So top of cladding. And the elevation, 4 feet, 1200 millimeters. Okay. So it's a good idea to have sat down beforehand and thought through what kind of things do we need. You might remember from my sketches, I had things like top of cladding, underside of beams, bottom of footings, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to reuse those, and I've got some of them in already. The only ones I think we're missing would be the top of a balustrade. So I need a new level type for that. Top of balustrade, and that's about 3 feet 4 inches, 1 meter is what I need. And that's a level, it's not controlling anything. Anything else? What about my skirting and my baseboard? So let's create my baseboard. The elevation about 6 inches, and the level type, you can call it baseboard or skirting, whichever suits you. And so I can use that in my wall styles. So just go through this before you go too far and actually do a sketch of your buildings, look at what levels you need to control, and have a look at what kinds of things you need. So it's really important that you get your levels in now as default story levels, because this is going to become our template file. So okay on that. Now you notice we haven't created any stories, so I need to create a new story. So this is story 1. I've tried renaming this, calling it level 1, that kind of thing. It didn't work out for me. So in this story, what do I need? I don't need a balustrade. I might need a baseboard. I need a slab. I can make this longer, so it's easier. So I need a bottom of footing, yes. I need a top of footing. I need a bottom of cladding. This particular building doesn't need a roof for this level. Cool, that's okay that, and we'll create a new one. So we've got a story above, and the difference in height between these two is about 10 feet. 10 feet, or if you want to, you can make it 3 meters. So the suffix is already added. You notice it's already added story 2. This one won't have a ceiling. It'll want to have a balustrade. I'm not sure I need the top of cladding at this point, but I won't have any foundations. I might have a slab. I will need a roof. I will need bottom of cladding, but I don't need top of footing and I don't need bottom of footing. So I can turn some on and some off. Now because they're defaults, they'll turn up always whenever I create a new story. And if this is my template file, whenever I start a new project, all my levels will be available and it'll make it a lot quicker to create my buildings. So those are all my stories. Let's just have a look at our design layers first. You can see it's added all of our design layers. This design layer here, this is going to become our site plan. So we can edit that and we can call it site plan or site model, whichever you want to call it, and we'll make the scale exactly the same, 1 to 100. So it's created quite a lot of design layers, and each design layer is connected to the stories. So that's quite powerful. We're just about ready to make our template, but before we do, I wanted to look at a couple of the tools. Let's start with something like the drawing label. When we place a drawing label, we've got the object property, so we can make our choices and we can choose how we like that to behave. And there's also an opportunity up here, or a button up here, that allows us to go back to that object properties and set those preferences. The challenge that we've got is we may not understand what it's going to look like until we can see it on the screen. So now we want to know what scale label looks like, or custom, or none. And so these choices that you can make are easier to see once you've got the object on the screen. We want drawing in sheet, for example, and we might want to set the font size, the length, that kind of thing. Now all of those choices are fine for that particular object, but what we need is a technique that will take our choices and apply them to our default. Let's go back to something like the north arrow. This isn't my favorite north arrow. I think it's number 3. I'll just have a look at that. It's one of these ones. No, must be at 4. That's it. That's the one I like. So I have choices that I like, and I like to make these and make sure that whenever I use this object, it's the same whenever I use it. So let's just have a look and see what we can do. In the Fundamentals course, you must have covered this tool here, the eyedropper tool. And what I'd like the eyedropper tool is to pick up just the plugin parameters only, nothing else, so nothing else is selected, just the plugin parameters, and pick up sets defaults. And what that means is that when I click on an object like this, it will suck up the parameters of that object and apply them back to that tool as the default. So I've clicked on both of those. Now if I go back to my drawing label, you'll see it's a perfect copy of that one. And if I go back to my north arrow, it's a perfect copy of that one. This is a very quick way of setting all of your preferences exactly the way you want. All you need is an object on the screen that has the settings the way you like, and then use the eyedropper tool to copy all those preferences. So there are some things that we need to put in our template and some things that we don't. Things like hatches, some of our classes we don't need to put in. We need to update our default levels and our default story layers. We also need to go through our preferences on each tool and set those as well. Once we've done that, we can then make this file into a template. So I'm just going to zoom out so I can see the whole page. I'm going to do my page setup again. I think I may have forgotten what it was, so that I should have had an A3 and it should have been landscape. That's better, so I just set my page area. Now I can make this into a template. So it's File, Save As Template. Not Save As, Save As Template. When you choose Save as Template, Vectorworks should open your Templates folder, which is in your User folder, and it should name the file default.sta. Leave that, because if you name this file default.sta, every day when you start Vectorworks, it will open this particular template file. So let's just save that. And so it's now stored that as my template file. So if I make a change, to an object, if I look at my revision marker, for example, which is this one here, and I place one of those and I go, well, that's, scale factor 1.5, that's how big I want it to be. So what class, what text style do I want to use? All those kinds of things, you can make that choice and then use your eyedropper, copy those attributes, and then File, Save as Template again. So this time when I save as template, there's already one there. It's named it the same thing. I go Save. It says you want to replace it. You go Yes, and you replace it. And that way you can keep your template file up to date. This is the end of lesson 1.3. In this lesson you learned when to use classes, you learned when to use design layers, you learned when to use stories and levels, you learned how to control tool defaults, and you learned how to save a template file. This is the end of Module 1. In Module 1 you learned how to create text styles and dimension standards, you learned when to use design layers and when to use classes, you learned how to create and control stories and levels, and you learned how to create a template file.